In the frozen chaos of December 1944, as the Ardennes forest swallowed sound and sight in its winter grip, a moment occurred that few men present ever forgot. A moment when hardened German officers, veterans of a 1,000-day war, opened the lid of an American K-ration box and understood, in one quiet instant, that everything they were fighting for was already slipping beyond reach. This was the opening phase of the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's final gamble in the West, and at its spearhead raced Joachim Peiper, a fiercely driven SS commander tasked with breaking through American lines and seizing the Meuse River before Allied reinforcements could react. His armoured column was a battering ram of Panthers, Tigers, and seasoned infantry, but it was also a force running critically short on the one resource it needed above all others: fuel. When Peiper's men captured the American supply depot at Büllingen, they found what seemed like a miracle: tens of thousands of gallons of gasoline, and alongside it, something far more revealing than any ammunition crate or map: boxes upon boxes of neatly packaged K-rations, complete meals sealed for individual soldiers, standardized, mass-produced, and stacked by the thousands. In those small cardboard boxes, Peiper's officers saw not just food, but the unmistakable signature of an enemy powered by an industrial engine so immense that even its frontline meals were evidence of a nation whose factories dwarfed anything the Reich could bring to the field. As Peiper pressed westward, the captured rations rode with him, silent reminders of the imbalance he faced. And yet, despite this fleeting glimpse into the true scale of American capability, the drive continued, because in this moment of the war, what mattered most was not what the Germans saw, but what they refused to understand. A war decided not by bullets, but by logistics. War is often remembered through the roar of artillery, the clash of armour, and the courage of the men who advance against fire, but behind every mile gained or lost lies a quieter, colder truth. Wars are decided not solely by the units on the front line, but by the supply chains that feed them, fuel them, and keep them alive long enough to fight. By the winter of 1944, this truth had become the unseen battlefield determining the fate of the German Ardennes Offensive, a campaign planned with boldness but starved of resources from the moment it began. Hitler envisioned a lightning strike through the American sector that would split Allied armies and force a negotiated peace, but his generals understood the hidden flaw. Germany no longer possessed the industrial depth to sustain such a massive operation. Their factories were bombed, their oil fields lost, their railways shattered. Meanwhile, the United States, with its vast production lines and unbroken supply routes stretching from the Atlantic ports to the very foxholes of Belgium, could replenish food, fuel, ammunition, even boots and overcoats faster than they could be consumed. Every American soldier carried the weight of an entire continent's industrial might, while every German soldier was fighting inside a system scraping the bottom of its reserves. This was the background to what Peiper's men unknowingly confronted when they cracked open those K-ration boxes. Proof that the war was no longer a contest of tactical brilliance or daring armour thrusts, but of which nation could keep its armies moving, fed, warm, and fuelled in the endless winter. And as the Ardennes Offensive unfolded, logistics, not firepower, would determine who advanced, who faltered, and ultimately who survived. Peiper's dash toward the Meuse begins. In the early hours of December 16, 1944, when the stillness of the Ardennes was shattered by the thunder of German artillery, Joachim Peiper's armoured spearhead surged forward under the cover of fog and surprise, embodying the very core of Hitler's last desperate gamble to seize the initiative in the West. Peiper, commanding Kampfgruppe Peiper of the 1st SS Panzer Division, had been personally chosen for this task because of his reputation for speed, aggression, and the brutal efficiency with which he executed armoured breakthroughs on the Eastern Front. His mission was clear: break through thin American lines, push west with unrelenting force, capture the Meuse River crossings, and create the rupture that would split Allied armies in two. From the moment his column began moving, Panthers rolling through forest roads, half-tracks grinding across icy fields, motorcycle scouts racing ahead. It was a race not just against the clock, but against the very limitations of Germany's failing war machine. The offensive depended entirely on momentum. If Peiper slowed down, even for a few hours, the entire operation risked collapsing under the weight of Allied air power and reinforcements. Yet even at the outset, cracks in the plan were already visible. Traffic jams clogged the narrow forest routes, delaying units that were supposed to clear Peiper's path. Fuel shortages forced last-minute reshuffling of vehicles, and the freezing cold strained engines and men alike. Still, Peiper pushed forward, driving his troops with the singular purpose of cutting through the American sector before the enemy could grasp what was happening. His column, stretching for miles, was a formidable force, but it was also a force built on the fragile hope that it could move faster than its fuel gauge could drop, and as the battle unfolded, that hope would become the one constraint Peiper could never outrun. Büllingen, 50,000 gallons of hope and a box of warnings. When Peiper's men stormed into the small Belgian village of Büllingen on December 17th, their advance had already begun to devour fuel at a rate no German staff officer dared admit, and it was here, amid the abandoned American supply depot, that they stumbled upon a discovery that briefly felt like salvation. Lined up in neat rows were fuel trucks and storage drums containing roughly 50,000 gallons of precious gasoline, enough to push the spearhead several miles closer to the Meuse and keep Peiper's armoured column alive for another day. But alongside this windfall, stacked in wooden crates and cardboard boxes, the Germans found something even more startling: the compact, meticulously organized American K-rations issued to every US infantryman. Each ration, sealed for individual use, contained canned meat, biscuits, powdered drinks, chewing gum, sugar tablets, cigarettes, and printed instructions. Items that, to a German soldier accustomed to thin soups and erratic resupply, looked like the luxuries of a different world. Officers tore open the packages in disbelief, noting not just the quantity but the standardization, the industrial precision behind every component, the sheer abundance that allowed the Americans to treat even their most basic meals as mass-produced products of a vast factory system. For a moment, the captured fuel gave Peiper hope that his push westward could continue. But the K-rations gave him something far more unsettling: evidence that he was fighting an enemy whose logistical power exceeded anything the Reich could even dream of. Men joked darkly that the Americans fought with factories on their backs, but inside those jokes lurked a dawning realization that these small boxes were not merely food, but symbols of a strategic reality Germany could not overcome. And as Peiper refueled his column and surged westward again, the rations rode along in his half-tracks, quiet warnings of a truth the coming days would make impossible to ignore. Inside a K-ration box, the arsenal of American abundance. To a hungry German soldier in December 1944, a single American K-ration box looked almost unreal. Something too clean, too organized, too plentiful to belong on a battlefield starved of everything from rubber to vitamins. And when Peiper's officers examined the contents closely, the implications struck with more force than any shell burst. Each K-ration, designed to sustain one soldier for one meal, was a miniature catalogue of America's industrial might. A tin of processed cheese or meat, powdered lemonade or coffee, vitamin-enriched biscuits, sugar tablets, chocolate, gum, cigarettes, a wax-coated spoon, toilet paper, water purification tablets, even printed menus and instructions. Nothing was improvised, nothing was repurposed, nothing depended on whatever happened to be available that day. These were not the irregular, improvised rations German troops received as production faltered and supply lines frayed. They were the standardized products of a country whose factories produced not hundreds of thousands, but millions of such meals, individually boxed, nutritionally calculated, and shipped across an ocean and half a continent without interruption. Peiper's men were stunned not just by the volume, but by what the rations symbolized about American doctrine. an army designed to keep every infantryman well fed, medically supported, and logistically sustained, no matter where he fought. German diaries from the Ardennes repeatedly note the same astonishment. How American forces seemed to possess an endless flow of food and equipment, how their abandoned positions contained more supplies than German units received in an entire month, how their crates held comforts, vitamin tablets, chocolate, cigarettes, that German high command could no longer provide even to elite SS formations. Peiper's officers understood, perhaps more clearly than their superiors in Berlin, that these boxes represented a fundamental imbalance in the war. They were not merely meals. They were proof that the United States fought with the full power of a nation whose resources dwarfed those of the Third Reich. And as Peiper pushed deeper into Belgium, those neat cardboard boxes became a quiet reminder that while Germany could still launch bold attacks, America could sustain a modern army in a way Germany never truly could. Fuel, the one thing even Peiper couldn't capture. Despite the shock and envy sparked by the K-rations, every man in Peiper's column understood that food was not the obstacle that threatened to halt their advance. Fuel was. From the moment Operation Wacht am Rhein was conceived, Peiper's spearhead was expected to survive by seizing American gasoline along the way, a requirement so precarious that several German generals privately considered the plan closer to wishful thinking than strategy. Hitler had ordered that his armoured divisions conserve every drop of fuel for the opening thrust, but by late 1944 the Reich had lost Ploiești, its refineries were shattered by Allied bombing, and synthetic fuel plants were producing only a fraction of the nation's needs. Peiper began the offensive with barely enough fuel for a one-way trip. His tanks could advance, but they could not return. His Panthers consumed nearly 2 gallons per mile, his Tigers nearly 4, and the freezing conditions forced engines to idle constantly to avoid freezing solid. The 50,000 gallons captured at Büllingen offered temporary relief, but it did not change the underlying truth. Every mile westward bled his reserves, and every firefight burned through the precious gasoline needed for the final dash to the Meuse. Peiper drove his men hard, pushing through American roadblocks with a sense of urgency that bordered on desperation, because he knew that momentum was not merely tactical, it was the only chance his column had to avoid stalling in enemy territory. His staff officers continuously recalculated fuel consumption, arguing over whether certain vehicles should be abandoned, which tanks should receive priority, and whether they could even afford detours to bypass American defences. The entire spearhead existed on a knife's edge, its fate determined not by the strength of its armour or the courage of its soldiers, but by the dwindling fuel sloshing at the bottom of jerrycans. And as Peiper accelerated towards Stavelot, he believed salvation might lie just ahead, a massive American depot that, if captured, could reignite the offensive. What he did not know was that this hope, like so many in the Ardennes, would dissolve only yards from his grasp. The race to Stavelot and the depot that should have saved them. On December 18, 1944, the frozen roads leading towards Stavelot became the stage for one of the most desperate and consequential sprints of the entire Ardennes offensive, as Peiper drove his armoured column toward what German intelligence insisted was a vast American fuel depot, millions of gallons that could propel the spearhead all the way to the Meuse, and perhaps even beyond. Stavelot itself stood as a critical choke point. Its narrow streets, stone houses, and the bridge over the Meuse River formed the last major barrier between Peiper and the fuel he needed to turn Hitler's grand gamble into reality. American defenders, though outnumbered and caught off guard, fought fiercely, holding the town just long enough to create confusion and force Peiper's units into close-quarters combat that burned precious time he could not afford to lose. After hours of brutal fighting, German tanks finally smashed through the defences and seized the bridge intact, a rare stroke of fortune in a campaign plagued by delays. Peiper believed the hard part was over. According to the maps and briefings he had been given, a massive fuel store awaited only a short distance beyond the river, positioned so conveniently that capturing it seemed almost inevitable. As his tanks roared across the bridge, throwing up churned snow and smoke, Peiper was convinced that within minutes he would lay eyes on the lifeline his battered column so desperately needed. But in the swirling chaos of the fight, amid darkness, smoke, and hurried navigation through unfamiliar streets, Peiper's armoured spearhead skirted past the critical road leading to the depot. Unbeknownst to him, 3 million gallons of American gasoline, stacked in plain sight along the roadside in thousands of jerry cans, lay only a few hundred yards from his route. And with that missed turn, the last realistic chance to fuel his drive to the Meuse slipped away into the winter night, setting the stage for the failure that would soon engulf his entire command. 300 yards from salvation. What happened next has puzzled historians, infuriated surviving officers, and become one of the most tragic examples of how chaos, not strategy, often determines the fate of armies. Peiper's column, after crossing the Amblève at Stavelot, drove directly past the very fuel depot that could have saved the entire German offensive, missing it by no more than 300 yards. It stood right there, stacked in endless rows of jerry cans along the roadside, shielded only by a small detachment of American engineers who had withdrawn mere minutes earlier. Yet Peiper never saw it, and neither did the tank commanders staring from armoured cupolas just feet away. The reason, ironically, lay in expectation. German intelligence had reported that the depot was enormous, a proper facility with storage tanks, pumps, and buildings, something unmistakably industrial in size and scale. But the Americans, in their typical pragmatic efficiency, had simply stored more than 3 million gallons of gasoline in individual 10-gallon cans spread across open ground. No fences, no towers, no warehouses, just stacks of fuel, completely exposed yet invisible to an enemy expecting something else. Peiper believed he would encounter a formal installation, not piles of jerry cans spread like ordinary cargo along the roadside, and in the fog and darkness of his rapid advance, that assumption proved fatal. As German tanks rumbled past the unguarded fuel, the opportunity evaporated in the cold air. Moments later, American troops regrouped and counterattacked, retaking the bridge and sealing off the route to the depot. By the time Peiper realized that fuel remained elusive, the chance to seize it was gone forever. The offensive's fate, indeed the fate of his entire Kampfgruppe, had just been determined not by a climactic battle or a superior strategy, but by a simple misinterpretation and a few hundred overlooked yards. And from that moment onward, every mile Peiper's column travelled was a mile toward exhaustion, entrapment, and the final collapse of the spearhead. Major Hal McCown, the American officer inside Peiper's encircled forces. Amid the fury of Peiper's westward push, one American officer found himself in the extraordinary position of witnessing the collapse of the German spearhead from the inside. Major Hal McCown, commander of the 2nd Battalion, 119th Infantry Regiment, captured during the rapid German advance and held with other prisoners as Peiper's Kampfgruppe fought its desperate way toward Stoumont. McCown, calm, observant, and determined to survive, understood that his unexpected proximity placed him in a unique position to document what was unfolding, and in the 3 days he spent inside the encircled German force, he watched its deterioration with the trained eye of a professional soldier. His later testimony, clear, methodical, and corroborated by other sources, described not the triumphant spearhead Hitler had envisioned, but an overextended unit struggling to sustain itself in the bitter cold. He saw German soldiers wrapped in captured American jackets and blankets, wearing US boots because their own had worn through or frozen stiff. He noted how badly the Germans craved American supplies. They ate captured rations almost exclusively, used American medical kits to treat their wounded, and scavenged fuel, food, and clothing wherever they could find it. McCown also observed Peiper himself, a commander visibly strained by the relentless pressure of the mission, his temper sharp, his eyes constantly fixed on the narrowing road ahead, and increasingly aware that his spearhead was running on little more than fumes and willpower. But it was the logistical decay, not the battlefield tactics, that struck McCown most forcefully. He recorded the shortages of bandages, the absence of morphine, the lack of antibiotics, the wounded shivering in basements where medics worked with almost nothing. By the time McCown was liberated, he carried with him a first-hand account that would later become one of the most valuable windows into the interior of a German armoured column on the brink of annihilation. Through his eyes, the myth of Peiper's unstoppable advance gave way to the reality of an elite force starving, freezing, and bleeding itself dry in the forests of Belgium. What McCown saw, an army running on fumes and desperation. As McCown observed Peiper's trapped command over those tense days around Stoumont, he witnessed with startling clarity how the once feared spearhead of the 1st SS Panzer Division was disintegrating not from enemy fire, but from exhaustion, deprivation, and an irreversible logistical collapse that no amount of courage or discipline could overcome. He saw German soldiers huddled together for warmth in captured farmhouses, their breath freezing in the air as they rationed the last scraps of food taken from American depots. Men gnawed at cold canned meat, drank melted snow, and fought over the remnants of K-rations that had seemed so plentiful only days earlier. He recorded medics treating grievous wounds without morphine, performing procedures in dim, unheated rooms where the temperature hovered below freezing, improvising splints from broken furniture and tearing cloth from captured uniforms to use as bandages. He noted how Peiper's officers argued in hushed tones about fuel allocation, whether to abandon more vehicles, which tanks still had enough gasoline to fight, and which ones would have to be sacrificed in place. The once proud armoured column now resembled a wounded animal crawling through the Ardennes, its strength bleeding away with every hour. McCown observed that many German soldiers had not slept for days. Their faces were hollow, their boots soaked through, their hands numbed by cold. Some had resorted to stripping American dead for gloves, socks, and coats, small comforts in a landscape where temperatures plunged toward zero. Peiper himself moved constantly among his men, issuing orders with a sharp, clipped urgency that revealed his own dawning realization. Without fuel, without food, and without hope of resupply, his Kampfgruppe could not break out, could not advance, and could not survive much longer. What McCown saw was not a force defeated in battle, but one defeated by mathematics, by the simple, merciless arithmetic of supply lines. And when he was finally rescued by advancing American forces, his report made it clear the German spearhead had reached its breaking point not at the hands of enemy tanks, but under the crushing weight of starvation, cold, and empty fuel tanks. Close quarters at Stoumont. Tanks without fuel and men without medicine. By December 19th, the village of Stoumont had become the tightening noose around Peiper's armoured spearhead, a place where the last remnants of his momentum finally collided with the brutal reality of empty fuel tanks and collapsing supplies. As American forces closed in from multiple directions, the once fearsome column found itself crammed into a shrinking pocket of fields, forests, and stone buildings, unable to maneuver and increasingly unable to fight. Tanks that had led the charge now sat idle behind hedgerows and barns, their engines cold, their hulks useless not because they had been destroyed, but because they simply had nothing left to burn. Crews stripped them of machine guns, radios, ammunition, anything that could still serve a purpose, while officers tried to calculate how much farther they could push the handful of vehicles that still held a few gallons in their bellies. Infantrymen dug in around the immobilized armor, fighting to hold a perimeter that shrank by the hour, while American artillery pounded the village with growing intensity. Inside makeshift aid stations, cellars, barns, and abandoned homes, McCown saw medics working with almost nothing, men moaning in the cold as their wounds froze and infections spread unchecked. German officers, frustrated and exhausted, snapped at one another as communication lines broke down and ammunition dwindled. Every attempt to break out was met with fierce American resistance. Every plan to resupply turned out to be impossible. What had begun as a lightning thrust across Belgium had now devolved into a bitter struggle for survival, one measured not in miles gained, but in minutes bought. Peiper's men were no longer an attacking force. They were a trapped, starving, freezing fragment of an overstretched army, clinging to the hope that a miracle might still open a path west. But the snow was falling harder, the American ring was closing tighter, and Peiper knew that time and fuel had finally run out. The abandonment at La Glaise, tigers left to die. On the night of December 23rd, as the last shreds of Peiper's dwindling force retreated toward the village of La Glaise, the final collapse of the German spearhead unfolded with a bleakness that even veterans of the Eastern Front had rarely witnessed. Surrounded on nearly every side by tightening American lines, battered by artillery, cut off from all communication with higher command, and, most critically, completely drained of fuel, Peiper faced a decision no armoured commander ever wants to confront, whether to save his men or save his machines. The outcome was inevitable. At La Glaise, with snow drifting through the narrow streets and the silhouettes of American armour closing in, Peiper ordered the abandonment of his remaining vehicles: 7 Tiger tanks, 50 medium tanks and assault guns, over 100 trucks, half-tracks and support vehicles. An armoured graveyard representing some of the most formidable equipment Germany had left. The crews, bitter and exhausted, smashed optics, disabled guns, burned maps and destroyed radios before slipping into the darkness on foot, leaving behind the proud steel beasts that had carried them through France, the Low Countries, and now the Ardennes. The sight was devastating. Tigers that had once dominated battlefields now sat silent and frozen, their massive frames powerless not because they had been outgunned, but because their fuel tanks were bone dry. Peiper led roughly 800 surviving men across icy fields and forest paths under cover of night, abandoning not just their machines, but the final hope of reaching the Meuse. By dawn, American troops entering La Glaise found one of the most astonishing scenes of the entire war: the wrecked and deserted remains of an elite panzer force that had once been the spearhead of Hitler's ambitious offensive. The abandonment at La Glaise was more than a tactical defeat. It was the physical, undeniable proof that the German offensive had collapsed not from lack of courage or fighting skill, but from the simple, devastating reality that without fuel, even the fiercest armoured force is nothing more than frozen metal in the snow. Manteuffel's verdict: tactical victory, strategic doom. In the years after the war, when German commanders were finally free to speak candidly about the Ardennes offensive, one voice stood out for its cold, professional clarity. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commander of the 5th Panzer Army, a man renowned for his tactical brilliance and his ability to extract the maximum from dwindling resources. Unlike Hitler, who insisted the failure at the Meuse was due to insufficient fanaticism or unexpected American resistance, Manteuffel delivered a stark and unvarnished assessment that cut to the heart of the matter. Germany had never possessed the logistical strength required for the offensive, and no amount of courage, speed, or battlefield success could compensate for that fatal deficit. He acknowledged that tactically, the Germans achieved remarkable feats in the opening days. Surprise was total, breakthroughs were deep, and American units reeled under the initial assault. But strategy is not measured in the brilliance of the first blow. It is measured in whether that blow can be sustained. Manteuffel explained that the German plan depended on capturing vast quantities of American fuel, an assumption so risky that it rendered the entire operation strategically unsound. He noted that the routes designated for the spearheads were too narrow, too vulnerable to traffic jams, too easily blocked by destroyed vehicles, that German units lacked sufficient reserves of ammunition, spare parts, and winter clothing, and that the Allies possessed overwhelming advantages in air power that would inevitably come into play once the weather cleared. In his post-war interviews and studies, Manteuffel returned again and again to the same conclusion. The Ardennes offensive was an operation launched with tactical audacity but without logistical feasibility, a campaign whose failure was sealed the moment the first tanks rolled forward with half-empty fuel tanks and no guarantee of resupply. For him, Peiper's stalled and starving spearhead was not an isolated tragedy, but the symbol of a broader truth. By late 1944, Germany could still fight brilliantly, but it could no longer fight sustainably. The war had become a contest of supply lines, and in that contest, Manteuffel insisted, Germany never had a chance. Peiper's interrogation, the final admission. When Joachim Peiper was captured months after the Battle of the Bulge and brought in for interrogation by American intelligence officers, he arrived with the reputation of a fierce and unyielding commander, but what emerged from those questioning sessions was not defiance. It was clarity, and at times an almost grim resignation. In the transcripts of his post-war interrogations, Peiper did not attempt to mask the truth. His spearhead had not been defeated by American armor or superior battlefield tactics, but by logistics, by fuel, and by the relentless arithmetic of supply that Germany could no longer escape. He admitted that from the very beginning of the offensive, his Kampfgruppe carried nowhere near the fuel required to reach the Meuse, let alone push beyond it. He acknowledged that he had been assured, incorrectly, that gasoline could be captured along the way, and that this assumption shaped every decision he made during the advance. He described the shock of discovering the K-rations at Büllingen, the envy and disbelief among his officers at the abundance of American supplies, and the frustration of realizing that the enemy's logistical capacity dwarfed anything the Reich could provide its most elite units. Most revealing were his comments on Stavelot. Peiper conceded that he had expected an industrial-scale depot, not millions of gallons casually stacked in jerry cans along the roadside, and that this misjudgment, combined with the chaos, darkness, and pressure of the advance, led him to drive unknowingly past the very fuel that could have changed the course of his mission. He accepted responsibility for choosing to preserve his men over his tanks at La Glaise, stating bluntly that he could not feed steel with courage. His interrogators noted that while he remained proud of his men's fighting ability, he spoke openly about the fundamental imbalance of the war. The Americans had everything: food, medicine, clothing, radios, spare parts, trucks, fuel, and the Germans had almost nothing. In his final remarks on the Ardennes Offensive, Peiper made a confession that echoed the conclusions of Manteuffel and every serious analyst of the campaign. Without fuel, there is no movement. Without movement, there is no attack. Everything else is illusion. It was a rare moment of candor from a man shaped by zeal and ambition, and it marked the point at which even Peiper himself acknowledged that the failure of the spearhead had been inevitable long before his tanks froze in the snow. It was all inside the K-ration box. In the final reckoning, when historians sifted through interrogation transcripts, after-action reports, and the frozen wreckage left behind in the Ardennes, one truth emerged with crystalline clarity. The fate of Kampfgruppe Peiper and of the entire German offensive had been foretold in the simple, unassuming American K-ration box that Peiper's men opened at Büllingen. Inside its compact cardboard frame lay more than food. It held the blueprint of a nation whose industrial engine had become unstoppable, a quiet symbol of the abundance, organization, and logistical mastery that sustained American forces from Normandy to the heart of Germany. The story of Peiper's thrust toward the Meuse was one of bold tactics, brutal fighting, and unyielding momentum, but it was also a story of dwindling gasoline, scavenged supplies, and soldiers forced to survive on whatever they could capture. The German offensive began with ambition, but ended with tigers abandoned in the snow, with men slipping through the dark on foot, and with fuel tanks as empty as the Reich's crumbling hopes. Major Hull-McCown's observations revealed the desperation within the spearhead. Manteuffel's analysis exposed the flawed assumptions behind the entire strategy, and Peiper's own interrogation confirmed what all three men had lived or witnessed firsthand, that no matter how fiercely Germany fought, it could not outproduce, outfeed, or outfuel the United States. And so, as the Battle of the Bulge drew to its bitter end, the lesson became unmistakable. Wars are not won by the sharpness of a single thrust or the brilliance of a daring commander. but by the power to sustain armies across continents and through the coldest winters. The German officers who opened that K-ration box saw more than a meal. They saw the industrial strength, the endless supplies, and the logistical certainty that made American victory inevitable. And as the snow settled over La Glaise, covering the silent hulks of abandoned tanks, the echo of that opening moment returned. The realization that the war had already been lost, and that the proof had been in their hands from the very beginning, printed on cardboard, sealed in wax paper, and delivered to the front by a supply chain Germany could never match.